The cockpit warning alarm screamed so loudly it drowned out every other sound. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, throwing sleeping passengers awake as luggage rattled inside overhead bins. Coffee spilled across tray tables. Oxygen masks trembled inside their compartments but did not deploy. At 38,000 feet, a jet carrying 203 people was no longer flying the way it was built to. "Captain! Captain!" The first officer reached toward the man beside her, but he had collapsed against his harness, one hand frozen over his chest. His face had turned pale, and his breathing was barely noticeable. Outside the windshield, endless darkness stretched across the sky. Inside, every second became a battle. The autopilot had shut itself off without warning. Flight computers were rejecting commands. Every correction the first officer made seemed to push the aircraft further off balance instead of bringing it back under control. Altitude dropped. The warning horn sounded again. She gripped the controls harder, fighting an airplane that suddenly seemed determined to ignore every lesson she'd spent years learning. "Come on. Come on." Nothing responded the way it should. Air traffic control declared a full emergency. Military radar stations picked up the struggling airliner. Within moments, 2 Army helicopters lifted into the night, racing toward its last known position. Their first radio message wasn't directed at the pilots. It wasn't directed at air traffic control. It was aimed at the terrified cabin crew. "Listen carefully," a calm military voice ordered over the emergency frequency. "Your passenger list includes someone with specialized combat aviation experience." The flight attendant's hands trembled as she scanned the electronic manifest. Her eyes suddenly stopped. "Row 9, Seat A." She looked toward the window. While children cried, while adults whispered final prayers, while the aircraft shuddered through another terrifying dive. The woman in Seat 9A remained asleep, curled against the window, head resting on a faded travel pillow, completely unaware that more than 200 strangers were only minutes away from becoming headlines around the world. The senior flight attendant didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, knelt beside her, grabbed both of her shoulders and shook with every ounce of strength he had. "Ma'am!" No response. The aircraft dropped again. He shook harder. "Wake up, please! We need you right now!" Her eyes slowly opened, and in that single moment, the fate of everyone on board began to change. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. Just 3 hours earlier, the night had felt perfectly ordinary. The departure hall at Orlando International Airport buzzed with the familiar rhythm of late-night travel. Families hurried toward their gates with sleepy children in their arms. Business travelers stared at glowing laptop screens while sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. Vacationers laughed over blurry vacation photos, unaware that this ordinary evening would soon become unforgettable. At Gate 42, Flight 1847 prepared for its overnight journey to Seattle. Ground crews completed their final inspections beneath the aircraft as baggage carts rolled away. Cabin lights glowed warmly through the windows, inviting passengers into what everyone expected to be another peaceful cross-country flight. Among the boarding crowd was a young woman carrying nothing more than a worn black backpack and a small insulated travel mug. She didn't attract a single curious glance. She wasn't dressed like someone important. A gray hoodie hung loosely over a plain t-shirt. Faded jeans, comfortable running shoes, and an old baseball cap covered most of her dark hair. There was no expensive luggage, no designer clothes, no jewelry. She looked exactly like someone heading home after an exhausting business trip. Her boarding pass identified her simply as Emily Carter. Occupation, federal employee. Nothing about those 2 words hinted at who she really was. She smiled politely as the gate agent scanned her ticket, thanked her without making conversation, and quietly walked down the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, she found Seat 9A, placed her backpack beneath the seat ahead, fastened her seatbelt, and leaned against the window before boarding had even finished. Across the aisle, an elderly couple debated which movie to watch. Behind her, 2 college friends joked about surviving final exams. Beside her sat a software engineer still typing emails as if the office had followed him onto the airplane. No one introduced themselves. No one asked her name. To every person around her, Emily was simply another anonymous traveler hoping to sleep through the 5-hour flight. Within minutes of the aircraft pushing back from the gate, her breathing slowed. Her eyes closed. She drifted into an unusually deep sleep, the kind that only comes after days of complete exhaustion. The flight attendants smiled as they walked past, careful not to wake her. None of them could have imagined that the quiet woman sleeping peacefully beside the window would soon become the only person aboard capable of helping save every soul on that aircraft. If anyone had looked beyond the words, "Federal Employee," printed on Emily Carter's travel records, they would have discovered a story almost impossible to believe. Emily wasn't an office worker, she wasn't an administrator, and she certainly wasn't someone who spent her days behind a desk. She was Chief Warrant Officer Emily Carter, one of the Army's most experienced special operations helicopter pilots, a woman trusted with missions so sensitive that many of them would never appear in any public record. For nearly a decade, Emily had lived a life divided into two worlds. One world was quiet. It consisted of ordinary grocery stores, airport terminals, birthday phone calls with family, and neighbors who thought she simply worked for the government. The other world existed in darkness. It was a place of rotor blades slicing through freezing night air, encrypted radios crackling with urgent voices, and split-second decisions that determined whether entire teams made it home alive. She had flown rescue operations through blinding sandstorms. She had guided helicopters between mountain ridges with almost no visibility. She had evacuated wounded soldiers while enemy fire flashed across the horizon. Her fellow pilots admired her for one reason above all others. When everyone else began doubting themselves, Emily became calmer. Years earlier, during a dangerous rescue mission overseas, a transport helicopter carrying injured soldiers lost power moments after taking off from a remote valley. Smoke filled the cockpit as warning lights illuminated every instrument panel. Another aircraft might have turned back. Emily didn't. Instead, she maneuvered through the narrow canyon with only seconds to spare, found a safe landing zone surrounded by jagged cliffs, and brought every injured soldier home alive. When the exhausted rescue team climbed out of the helicopter, one medic simply stared at her before quietly saying, "When everything falls apart, somehow you always find a way." The nickname stayed with her. Among military aviators, she became known as North Star, not because she was fearless, because no matter how dark the night became, others trusted her to guide them home. Yet beneath that remarkable reputation was a woman running on almost no sleep. For the previous 72 hours, Emily had completed one demanding operation after another, before finally receiving a few days of approved leave. She wasn't flying toward another mission. She was flying toward something much more personal. Her older brother had just welcomed his first child into the world. Months earlier, Emily had made him one simple promise. "No matter what happens," she had said with a smile, "I'll be there to meet my little nephew." She had kept far more dangerous promises in her life. There was no chance she was going to break this one. So she boarded Flight 1847, leaned against the window, and surrendered to the deepest sleep she'd had in weeks, completely unaware that destiny had already chosen her next mission. Pitt, Captain Daniel Reeves, a veteran pilot with more than 25 years in commercial aviation, glanced over the flight displays with quiet confidence. Beside him, First Officer Rachel Kim monitored the instruments while chatting casually about the clear weather ahead. "It looks like we'll arrive a little early," Rachel said with a smile. Daniel nodded. "Let's hope every flight is this easy." The sentence had barely left his mouth when a sharp warning tone shattered the calm. "Beep, beep, beep." A bright red caution message flashed across the flight display. Autopilot disconnected. Rachel frowned. "That's strange." Before she could reach for the checklist, another warning appeared. "Flight control computer failure." Then another, and another. Within seconds, the cockpit that had been calm moments earlier became a storm of flashing alerts, warning chimes, and rapidly changing system messages. Daniel grabbed the controls. "I have the aircraft." Except, he didn't. The jet suddenly rolled hard to the right without command. Coffee splashed across the center console. Loose checklists slid onto the cockpit floor. Rachel tightened her harness as the aircraft dropped several hundred feet in a matter of seconds. "I'm correcting left," she shouted. The airplane responded by banking even farther right. Daniel stared at the instruments in disbelief. "That's impossible." He pulled gently to stabilize the nose. Instead, the aircraft pitched downward into another frightening descent. Every movement they made seemed to produce the opposite result. Years of training suddenly meant almost nothing. Then disaster struck again. Daniel stopped speaking mid-sentence. His breathing became shallow. One trembling hand pressed against his chest. Rachel looked over. "Captain?" His eyes widened with pain. "I can't." Before she could reach him, his body slumped forward against the harness. "Captain!" No response. Rachel's heartbeat thundered in her ears. For one terrifying moment, fear nearly overwhelmed her. She was alone. One pilot, a failing aircraft. More than 200 lives depending entirely on her. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to think. Her hand reached for the public address microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "This is your first officer speaking. We are experiencing a serious in-flight emergency. If there is anyone on board with advanced aviation experience, particularly military or test flight experience, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The announcement echoed through the silent cabin. Passengers exchanged frightened looks. Some clutched their loved ones. Others whispered prayers. No one stood. No one answered. Except one senior flight attendant whose eyes suddenly widened as he remembered a single line from the passenger manifest. A line he had almost ignored before takeoff. The aircraft shaking beneath his feet and frightened voices filling the cabin, one memory suddenly surfaced. Emily Carter. Occupation, federal employee. Home address, Fort Novus. Fort Novus wasn't just another military installation. It was one of the country's largest aviation training centers. Michael's heart skipped a beat. "What if?" he whispered. Without wasting another second, he hurried toward row 9, steadying himself against the seats as another violent jolt rocked the aircraft. Passengers grabbed his arm as he passed. "What's happening? Are we going to crash? My son is crying." Michael wanted to answer every one of them. Instead, he kept moving, because if his instinct was right, there wasn't a second to lose. He reached seat 9A. Emily hadn't moved. Her head still rested against the window. The same faded gray hoodie. The same peaceful expression. It was almost impossible to believe that while panic spread through the cabin, she remained completely asleep. Years of non-stop military operations had taught her body to sleep through almost anything. Michael leaned down and gently touched her shoulder. "Ma'am?" Nothing. He tried again, this time louder. "Ma'am, I need you to wake up." Still nothing. Another violent drop sent screams echoing through the cabin. The airplane shuddered so hard that several overhead bins burst open, scattering bags into the aisle. Michael abandoned all hesitation. He grabbed both of Emily's shoulders. "Emily, wake up, right now!" Her eyelids slowly opened. For several long seconds, she simply blinked. The cabin around her seemed unfamiliar. The frightened faces, the flashing seatbelt signs, the trembling floor beneath her feet. Then the aircraft rolled sharply to one side. Emily didn't panic. She frowned. Not because she was scared, but because something about that movement felt terribly wrong. Years of flying helicopters had trained her body to sense an aircraft's condition before her mind could explain it. She looked directly at Michael. "What happened?" His voice cracked. "Our captain collapsed. The flight controls are malfunctioning. The first officer asked if there's anyone with military aviation experience." Emily's sleepy expression disappeared instantly. "What kind of malfunction?" "They said the airplane isn't responding correctly." She unbuckled her seatbelt in one swift motion. Her exhaustion vanished as though someone had flipped a switch. "Take me to the cockpit." Michael hesitated only long enough to unlock the secure cockpit procedure. As they hurried forward, frightened passengers watched in silence. No one knew who the quiet woman in the gray hoodie was. To them, she looked like an ordinary traveler. But inside the cockpit, everything changed. Emily took one look at the flashing warning screens, the unconscious captain, and the terrified first officer desperately wrestling with the controls. Less than 5 seconds passed before she quietly said, "Don't explain everything." She fixed her eyes on the flight instruments. "Just tell me exactly what the aircraft does when you touch the controls." The answer would determine whether all 203 people on board would ever see the ground again. The cockpit had become a storm of alarms. Warning lights flashed across every display. The control column vibrated. The aircraft continued drifting off course despite the first officer's desperate corrections. Every passing second drained more altitude, more fuel, and more hope. Emily didn't waste time introducing herself. Instead, she watched. Years of military flying had taught her that the first few seconds inside any emergency were priceless. The loudest person in the room wasn't always the most helpful. The best pilots observed before acting. "Show me," she said calmly. First Officer Rachel Kim tightened her grip on the controls. "I bank left." The aircraft rolled right. "I lower the nose." The jet pitched upward. "I correct again." "It overreacts." Rachel interrupted herself, frustration filling her voice. "Nothing makes sense anymore." Emily's eyes never left the instruments. She wasn't looking at individual warnings. She was looking for rhythm, patterns. Aircraft rarely behaved without reason. Even damaged machines followed rules, if someone could find them. "Do it again," Emily said. Rachel repeated the movement. Emily leaned closer. "There." Rachel looked confused. "What?" "It isn't random." Rachel stared at her. "What do you mean?" Emily pointed toward the flight display. "The airplane isn't ignoring you. It's translating your commands incorrectly. Some inputs are reversed, others are delayed. It's following a broken language." Rachel blinked. "So, it's predictable?" Emily nodded slowly. "I think so." For the first time since the emergency began, a small spark of hope appeared inside the cockpit. Emily immediately reached for the radio. "This is Flight 1847. I need direct coordination with Military Aviation Command and an aircraft systems specialist. We have a pilot medical emergency and severe flight control corruption." Air traffic control answered almost instantly. "Flight 1847, assistance is already being coordinated. Stand by." 30 tense seconds passed. Then a new voice came over the frequency. Calm, confident, military. "This is Colonel Nathan Brooks with Joint Aviation Command. Please identify the person assisting the flight crew." Emily pressed the transmit button. "Chief Warrant Officer Emily Carter, Army Special Operations Aviation." Silence filled the frequency. Then the colonel spoke again, his tone noticeably different. "North Star?" Emily hesitated for only a moment. "Affirmative. I've heard about your rescue operations." "I'm not here because of my reputation," Emily replied quietly. "I'm here because this crew needs help." "And they'll have it," the colonel answered. "We're scrambling every available resource." Moments later, another voice joined the emergency channel. A retired aircraft systems engineer who had spent decades studying the exact model they were flying. Emily glanced toward Rachel. "Listen carefully," she said. "I'm not qualified to fly this airplane." Rachel's face fell. Emily continued before panic could return. "But you are." Rachel looked at her in disbelief. "You know this aircraft." "I know damaged aircraft," Emily corrected. "Different machine, same principle." She met Rachel's eyes. "I won't touch the controls. I'll help you understand what the airplane is trying to tell us." Outside the cockpit windows, two tiny lights suddenly appeared in the darkness. They were moving incredibly fast, and they were heading straight toward the struggling airliner. The two distant lights grew larger with astonishing speed. Within moments, the unmistakable silhouettes of two military helicopters emerged from the darkness, their navigation lights flashing against the night sky. Flying with remarkable precision, they eased into formation on either side of the struggling passenger jet. For the frightened passengers looking out their windows, it was a surreal sight. Some gasped, others began crying with relief. Several pulled out their phones, recording the helicopters that now seemed to be silently escorting them through the darkness. Inside the cockpit, another radio transmission crackled to life. "Flight 1847, this is Guardian 1, flight of 2 Army Blackhawks. We have visual contact. We'll remain with you until you're safely on the ground." Emily picked up the microphone. "Guardian 1, this is Chief Warrant Officer Emily Carter. I need you to maintain close visual formation. Report any unusual attitude changes immediately." A brief silence followed. Then the helicopter pilot answered, his voice filled with disbelief. "Chief Carter?" Emily recognized the hesitation. "Go ahead." "Ma'am, are you North Star?" She smiled faintly despite the chaos. "I've been called that." The pilot let out a quiet laugh. "I trained at Fort Novus 5 years ago. Our instructors used your rescue missions as case studies. Never imagined I'd hear your voice on a commercial emergency." Emily's tone remained calm. Tonight isn't about stories, Captain. No, ma'am. It's about getting 203 people home. Understood. The helicopters tightened their formation, becoming steady reference points outside the cockpit windows. At the same time, the retired aircraft systems engineer joined the emergency frequency. I've analyzed the failure reports, he said. Chief Carter was right. The flight control software isn't failing randomly. The response changes only after certain control thresholds. Emily nodded as if she had expected the answer. There it is. She turned toward Rachel. The airplane has rules. Rachel swallowed nervously. I'm listening. When you make small corrections, the aircraft lies to you. Rachel frowned. But larger inputs, the response becomes normal. Rachel took a slow breath. Emily continued issuing instructions with quiet confidence. Forget your instincts. Trust the instruments, not your muscles. Every command sounded backwards. Every correction felt wrong. Yet each time Rachel obeyed, the aircraft stabilized a little more. Altitude steadied. The violent rolling slowed. Passengers who had been silently praying noticed something remarkable. The shaking wasn't gone, but it wasn't getting worse anymore. Air traffic control soon cleared every aircraft from hundreds of miles of airspace ahead. Their emergency destination was selected, Denver International Airport, one of the country's longest runways. Every rescue vehicle was already racing into position. Emily looked toward the glowing runway data appearing on the navigation display. The hardest part still lay ahead. Keeping the aircraft airborne had been one battle. Landing it with a crippled flight control system would be something entirely different. And there would be no second chance. The lights of Denver International Airport slowly emerged on the horizon like a distant island in a sea of darkness. To the passengers, they were a sign of hope. To the people inside the cockpit, they marked the beginning of the most dangerous part of the flight. Keeping a damaged aircraft in the sky was difficult. Landing it safely was another challenge entirely. The runway stretched nearly 3 miles ahead, illuminated by rows of white approach lights that shimmered beneath the night sky. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue vehicles lined both sides of the pavement, their flashing lights turning the airport into a field of red and blue. Inside the cockpit, no one spoke for several seconds. The only sounds were warning alarms, controlled breathing, and the steady voice of air traffic control counting down the distance. Emily finally broke the silence. Rachel, you've already done the impossible. Rachel kept her eyes fixed on the instruments. I don't feel like I have. You've held this airplane together for almost an hour. A nervous smile crossed Rachel's face. I'm still terrified. So am I. Rachel looked at her surprised. Emily nodded. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing not to let fear make the next decision. Those words settled over the cockpit like calm after a storm. 5,000 feet, air traffic control announced. The Blackhawks remained just outside the windows, matching every movement with astonishing precision. 3,000. The aircraft drifted slightly left. Rachel instinctively reached for a small correction. Emily immediately stopped her. Not yet. Rachel froze. Wait. She watched the instruments. There. Now make a firm correction. Rachel pushed the controls farther than every instinct told her to. The aircraft smoothly returned to centerline. It worked, Rachel whispered. Emily smiled. I told you the airplane has rules. The runway grew larger. 1,000 feet. You're perfectly aligned. 500. Passengers looked through the windows, finally seeing the ground. Many held hands. Some closed their eyes. Others silently mouthed prayers. 100 feet. Rachel's heartbeat pounded so loudly she could barely hear the radio. This is it. Emily spoke one final time. When we reach 50 feet, Rachel nodded. I know. Trust what you've learned tonight, not what your instincts remember. 50 feet. Every lesson Rachel had learned over thousands of flight hours screamed for her to pull back. Instead, she pushed forward. For one endless heartbeat, the entire aircraft seemed to hang between disaster and survival. Then, thud. The main landing gear slammed onto the runway. A second later, the nose gear settled smoothly. Spoilers deployed. Reverse thrust roared to life. The aircraft slowed. Faster, slower, until finally, it rolled to a complete stop. Silence filled the cockpit. No alarms mattered anymore. Rachel released the controls, covered her face with trembling hands, and burst into tears. Behind them, the cabin exploded with applause, laughter, crying, and grateful cheers. 203 strangers who had expected to die were alive. And outside, the two Blackhawks circled once above the runway before dipping their noses in a quiet salute to the exhausted crew below. The moment the aircraft stopped, the silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then the cabin erupted. Applause thundered through the aisles. Some passengers laughed uncontrollably, overwhelmed by relief. Others buried their faces in the shoulders of loved ones, crying without shame. A little boy who had spent the last 20 minutes clutching his mother's arm suddenly shouted, "We're alive!" His words spread through the cabin like a wave, and strangers who had never met embraced each other as if they were family. Outside, flashing emergency lights raced toward the aircraft from every direction. Fire engines surrounded the jet. Ambulances stopped beside the cockpit. Airport rescue teams climbed aboard almost immediately, moving with calm precision. Their first destination was the flight deck. Captain Daniel Reeves was carefully lifted from his seat and placed onto a stretcher. Though still weak, he opened his eyes for a brief moment. His gaze drifted toward Rachel and Emily before a faint smile crossed his face. "You brought them home," he whispered. Then the paramedics wheeled him away. Rachel remained frozen in her seat, staring at the windshield where the runway lights slowly faded into the distance. Her hands still trembled from gripping the controls. Emily quietly unfastened her harness. Only then did the exhaustion she had been ignoring come rushing back. Her shoulders felt heavy, her eyes burned, and every muscle in her body reminded her that she had barely slept in days. Rachel suddenly stood and crossed the cockpit. Without saying a word, she wrapped Emily in a tight embrace. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice breaking. Emily gently smiled. "Yes, you could." Rachel pulled back and shook her head. "No, you saw what none of us could." Emily looked toward the silent cockpit instruments. "I've spent years flying aircraft that refuse to behave," she replied softly. "Machines fail. People don't have to." A knock came at the cockpit door. "Ma'am," a rescue officer said, "the helicopter crews are waiting outside." Emily stepped onto the mobile stairs into the cool night air. The two Blackhawks sat nearby with their rotors finally still. Their crews stood in a straight line. As Emily approached, every pilot raised a crisp salute. She seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. One young captain smiled. "I've wanted to meet North Star for years." Emily returned the salute before lowering her hand. "Forget the nickname," she said with a tired grin. "Tonight belonged to every person who refused to give up." Far above them, dawn painted the eastern sky with the first shades of gold. For everyone who had survived Flight 1847, it wasn't just the start of a new day, it felt like the beginning of a second chance at life. A single interview, she chose a quiet military publication instead of a major television network. Sitting in a modest conference room, still wearing the same calm expression that had carried her through the emergency, she answered every question without seeking attention. "Were you scared?" the interviewer asked. Emily smiled honestly. "Absolutely." The room grew silent. "People think courage means you're never afraid," she continued. "That's not true. Courage begins the moment you admit you're afraid, and keep moving anyway." The interviewer leaned forward. "When you walked into that cockpit, what was your first thought?" Emily didn't answer immediately. She looked down for a moment before speaking. "I knew there were things I didn't know. I'd never flown that aircraft. Pretending to know everything would have been dangerous." "So, what did you rely on?" "My training." She folded her hands together. "Training teaches you something bigger than memorizing procedures. It teaches you how to stay calm when the procedure no longer exists." The interviewer nodded. "People are calling you a hero." Emily shook her head almost instantly. "No. The hero was the first officer who trusted guidance that felt completely wrong. The flight attendants who stayed calm while passengers panicked. The air traffic controllers who cleared an entire sky. The engineers who found answers in minutes. The helicopter crews who flew beside strangers simply so they wouldn't feel alone." She paused, her voice softer now. Nobody survives something like that by themselves. A few days later, Emily finally reached her brother's house. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no reporters, no flashing lights, just a quiet front porch, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through an open window, and the sound of a baby laughing inside. When the front door opened, her brother smiled without saying a word. He simply placed his tiny son into her arms. Emily looked down at the sleeping child, gently holding one of his impossibly small hands. For a long moment, the world seemed perfectly still, not because the danger had been forgotten, but because it had led her back to the people she loved most. As the morning sunlight filled the room, Emily realized something she had learned countless times in the cockpit, but never fully understood until now. Life isn't measured by the storms you survive. It's measured by the people waiting for you when the storm is finally over. If this story reminded you that courage, humility, and teamwork can change lives, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes aren't the ones looking for recognition. They're simply the ones who choose to stand up when everyone else is running out of hope.